week. All right, so I'll send out we may not get to play a review game here in class, but I'll send one out to you guys so you can review for the weekend, Friday and Monday, and all of those stuff. All right, so we'll test before Thanksgiving break, and then when we get back, we'll start on executive and try to knock that out in judicial branch. After Chapter 7, that's when we'll do the U.S. Constitution. All right. I don't know if I'll test over 7 per se. We'll see how we go on time. Like, so this is all very new, but we'll figure it out. Okay. All right. So this is section 3 here, and I sent out, I guess was it yesterday, the kind of the little worksheet on the kind of the powers and privileges and stuff like that of the legislative branch. If you look in the Constitution, Article 1 deals with the legislative branch. It's the longest article. All right. And so, particularly there's within a section called Section 8, there's a number of clauses, about 18 clauses in all, right? So this is the largest part of the U.S. Constitution. The framers initially kind of had the legislative branch as kind of the most important branch, really. While they're all pretty relatively equal, the framers kind of worked that out and such. As time goes on, we start to see in recent times, the executive branch kind of asserting a little bit more power and influence through certain court cases and such. All right, so when we talk about powers of the legislative branch, of Congress and that, they usually kind of break it down into kind of 3 forms of power. Right. The first one we kind of talked about this concept of delegated powers, and a lot of times this is given to the federal government, specifically stated within the Constitution. Sometimes they're referred to as enumerated powers. Right, in the worksheet there, I'll give you they talk about enumerated powers. Like I said, this is mentioned primarily in Section 8. And Section 8 has 18 clauses within Section 8 that list specifically the powers of the legislative branch. All right, so delegated powers are also known as enumerated powers. These are specifically listed in the Constitution. All right, so some of those powers we're going to go through. A big one with anything is financing the government, basically generating revenue. Revenue is money that the government takes in. All right, a lot of that comes through collecting of taxes, right? We had talked about for a long time, kind of incomes weren't taxed. That wasn't until we talked about the 16th Amendment that was established there with the IRS and that. But also this includes borrowing money. The government borrows a lot of money. Right? Have you heard the national debt? When they talk about the national debt, they're talking about the money that we've borrowed. Right? Printing and coining money. This was a big thing initially when they framed the Constitution here, because one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation was a lot of those states they had their own currency. All right, so this was a kind of specifically stated that Congress has the right to kind of issuing the kind of coining of money. All right, and all kind of programs provide for defense and stuff like that. All right, so this is a big part of what Congress does, primarily when we talk about the House of Representatives. All right. The House of Representatives, there's a Finance Committee, there's a House Ways and Means Committee that is important in a way to kind of determine where this tax dollars go and such. All right, so initially, prior to kind of income tax, a big portion of the revenue that the federal government was getting in was in duties and excises. Duties are basically tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. Right, and in the later part of the 20th century here, things like NAFTA and that have been kind of the idea of trying to kind of limit tariffs. Because the idea behind tariffs in many cases is that if we issue kind of tariffs on goods coming in from a certain country, then those countries will kind of do in turn, right? That was one of the factors that may have led to one of the factors of the Great Depression, all right? Recently, we've been engaged in kind of a tariff kind of war with China. All right, with the Trump administration kind of issuing new tariffs on kind of Chinese goods and stuff. But for months before income taxes, that was a big part of how the government was funded. And then excises, internal taxes on things like manufacturing, sales taxes, right? And then consumption of a commodity, mean any type of goods and that. So duties and excises before the 16th Amendment were a big part of how the government was basically being funded, all right? And then the second one is kind of regulation. Regulating, encouraging kind of trade, industry. So Congress has the power within Section 8 to regulate trade with foreign countries. Also, with initially it states with Native American tribes. That obviously has changed over time. And then also kind of within this, the idea of kind of encouraging, particularly when we talk about like kind of the 19th century, the 1800s, encouraging inventions. The United States, if you guys take a U.S. history class next year or whatever, you guys talk about how like kind of in the 1800s, the U.S. was kind of a place for kind of a lot of like inventions when it comes during the industrial age and such. So a big thing here, like kind of regulating, kind of it ties in with the first one here, kind of regulating with kind of like tariffs and excises and such. All right. States trade between states as well. What they call interstate trade is a big part of this this power as well. All right. A clause that's been kind of cited regularly throughout history would be Section 8, Clause 3, which is often referred to as the Commerce Clause. So the Commerce Clause tends to be kind of like a somewhat of a kind of a wide-ranging clause here, which gives Congress the power to regulate trade, like I said, with foreign countries, but also between states. So the whole idea of interstate trade, right? Commerce Clause has been cited as a reason for, like, for example, like kind of regulating things like when during the Civil Rights era. There was an incident where basically you had a number of like kind of in the South where they had separate facilities for those riding buses, right? And there was a group called the Freedom Riders that basically kind of like tested the kind of Commerce Clause in the sense that the federal government had to regulate these kind of situations here. Were these separate facilities kind of constitutional under the Commerce Clause? All right, and so this was like, and this also regulates things like during the New Deal. All right, this was used as a means to kind of like for FDR would cite this as a means to try to get pushed through a lot of legislation through the New Deal. All right, so the Commerce Clause tends to be cited quite frequently in a means for the kind of federal government, and it means to kind of not just regulate taxes, but kind of like laws that pertain to also like amendments like Amendment 14. All right, so this is probably the more famous clauses within Section 8. Let's keep on going. Also, too, like I said, it's kind of encouraging the idea of inventions here, right? Under Section 8, under the Commerce Clause, the idea of kind of Congress issuing and the concept of patents and copyrights. A patent is basically something an inventor writes to their invention to own and sell. All right, there's numerous patents all being sent to the federal government that are regulated through a patent office that's kind of like funded and such by Congress. So if you have an idea to making a better mousetrap, as they would say, you would basically issue a patent. You have to go through detail on how your item works here, and there's a lot of times you have people who have the same ideas. All right, so it's important to get those in, and then the idea, like these guys who also kind of invent these things, to sell them. To sell the patent. And then copyright is usually for artists and writers and things of that nature. All right. The idea, I have a band and we have to copyright all our kind of like we put out CDs and stuff like that, and we had to kind of get a copyright kind of like for stuff. So in case somebody takes your what they call intellectual property. All right. This has been something that's been tested though since like kind of like the internet, right? And the whole idea, like a lot of times people are kind of bootlegging things and stuff like that. So the kind of when Congress kind of like when this was established, the people, the framers had no concept of the internet, right? So a lot of these things are going to be tested as they were kind of initially kind of written, if you will. But this is all kind of under Section 8 as well. Big one, defending the country. All right, when it comes, Congress has the power to declare war and to maintain armed forces. Now, we'll talk a little when we talk about kind of like the executive branch and their ability to send troops into military conflicts without declaring war, right? Like, for example, the Vietnam War was never a declared war per se, all right? And we'll talk about something called the Wars Power Act was kind of added into that. Also creating lower courts, establishing circuit and appellate courts. Each region here has like kind of a region, like a district courts and stuff like that. That you'll hear the numbers, and the federal courts essentially are. While the judicial branch is the one who kind of basically is kind of part of that court system, it's Congress that determines where these courts are set up at. All right, so that was all basically, that's all in Section 8 as well. All right, and then providing growth. Congress can pass laws to regulate things like immigration and naturalization, governing territories like Guam, Puerto Rico, and provide for admission to new states. Like periodically, we always hear about kind of like Puerto Rico, and kind of maybe becoming the 51st state. There's periodically there's a kind of a vote on that, if you will. All right. Under Section 8, Congress can determine, and this has become like something when they talk about things like DACA, which we'll talk about. We talked about in Chapter 1. All right. DACA was initially set up as a executive order. All right, and Congress has to. There's been kind of cases where Congress is trying to kind of take that back in means to try to kind of regulate that. Naturalization is simply the process in which a foreign-born person becomes a U.S. citizen. Simple as that. Those who are going through the naturalization process are doing basically what you guys are doing. They're taking the Constitution. All right, you take a Constitution test. That's your test to getting, and they're basically studying to what you guys are studying. All right. I remember in college I had a guy that we had a government class, and this one dude just kept on answering. He was just like knocking him out. I mean, he was from Pakistan, I remember, and he was like knocking questions out. And our professor stopped and tried to basically say it's pathetic that this guy knows more about your government than you do. And we kind of felt bad. And then I talked to the guy at break. He was going through the naturalization process, so he was taking this simultaneously, but he was killing it. He was knocking it out of the park, And so you'll find famously on the 4th of July, they'll have a big swearing in kind of ceremony for a lot of people. All right, but that just doesn't happen on the 4th of July. So this is regulated by Congress. All right, under Section 8. All right, and then you have implied powers. When you imply something, essentially, it's it's kind of it's not officially stated, but it's kind of an idea. All right, so the 18th clause. Or the 18th section of 18th clause, of Section 8 there. It's called the elastic clause. When you think about elastic kind of stretches, right? So the elastic clause is put in there, basically giving Congress what they call the powers for necessary and proper laws and stuff. And this idea, anything that comes up that, for example, the founders of, the guys who wrote the Constitution had no idea about air travel. Right, had no concept of air travel, right? They had no concept of the internet and stuff. So the elastic clause allows for the Constitution to change with the changing times of it. Allows to give Congress certain things to regulate things like air travel. And then we have established, which is kind of an agency within the executive branch, the FAA, all right, or communications and stuff like that. This was kind of put in there to kind of say there's going to be stuff that comes up that we have no idea that's going to be here, all right. So this gives Congress, particularly under the Constitution, the right to kind of regulate certain things that will occur in the future. All right. So they refer to it oftentimes as the elastic clause. A big one also is that they have the power to impeach. All right. And we had just kind of gone through this in November. All right. So impeachment, the process of impeachment. Impeachment is just basically to impeach is to accuse a member of the executive or judicial branch with a particular crime against the Constitution. Doesn't necessarily mean it's basically kind of if you're not upholding your kind of office duties, if you've overextended your boundaries, if you will. Right? So the House of Representatives brings charges. So just this time last year, President Trump was going through impeachment. All right, the House brought him on charges that he was basically kind of trying to basically stiff arm, if you will, the president of Ukraine to investigate who later becomes his rival in the election, Joe Biden, and his son's position in a kind of company called Burisma, which is kind of like an energy company in Ukraine. So this was brought up. The phone call was recorded in that. The House brought him up on charges. And then the Senate, they hold a trial. Now, the problem is that the Senate, you have to have 2/3 of the Senate must find the official guilty. All right. So President Trump was impeached, but he wasn't found guilty. All right. You remember how many presidents we've had that have been impeached? Three. Yeah, 3. So Andrew Johnson, this was during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. And then Bill Clinton, and then Donald Trump. So those three have been impeached, but they've never found guilty. Probably one that came the closest without becoming impeached was Richard Nixon during the whole Watergate scandal. He resigned before before the impeachment, before he was even impeached. All right, so that he probably, from evidence, probably would have been found guilty. So this is a power that's specifically this is probably the most famous power that Congress has, and it's like we're talking about checks and balances. It's a check on the other branches, if you will. All right. Also, too, particularly with the Senate. The Senate a lot of times plays this kind of role of kind of like the stopgap, or basically the one that basically gives the kind of final say on certain things like treaties. A treaty is a written agreement with a foreign nation. Right? Presidents can sign treaties, but they have to be approved by the Senate by a 2/3 vote. So famously in history, like after World War One, the treaty that ended World War One, the Versailles Treaty, Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson, who was the president, kind of pushed through a lot of aspects of the Treaty of Versailles, things like the League of Nations and stuff like that. However, he signed this treaty. When he got back to Congress, the Senate didn't approve it. All right, so the United States eventually had to kind of sign separate treaties with like Germany, what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All right, cabinet members and Supreme Court justices must also be approved by the Senate as well. All right, we just went through one here with Amy Coney Barrett, who replaced Ruth Bader Ginsburg. All right, this was just a couple months ago. All right, that's basically kind of simple, like it's not a 2/3 vote. It's just a simple majority vote. All right, so the Senate approves a lot of these things. All right, the House of Representatives does more legislation. The Senate does more kind of approvals. All right, and then also this is the things that these are kind of some terms that kind of are Latin in nature. A couple of them here. What Congress cannot do is they cannot pass ex post facto laws. All right, ex post facto meaning after the fact, basically laws that apply to actions that occurred before the laws were passed. All right, so like for example, let's say there was a law against, I don't know, let's say there was a law against going to school with a mask on. All right. And so essentially, if you were wearing a mask before, then they passed a law saying you can't wear a mask now. All right. They couldn't charge, if that law went into account, let's say next week, they couldn't charge you for what you were doing today. All right. So that's the idea. All right. Now, bills of attainder, this is the idea they can't pass a law. Basically, kind of a person has to be, and this is kind of mentioned in the 5th and 6th and 7th Amendments here. This idea that you can't put a person in prison without a trial. However, during cases of war or insurrection, sometimes these have been violated. All right, and the Constitution specifically states that in cases of invasion, in cases of kind of insurrection and stuff like that, these can be, particularly with the executive branch, they can be suspended. All right, but that's the idea at any point. This is kind of listed within the kind of 5th, 6th, and 7th Amendments here. And the other one is writ of habeas corpus, which is a Latin term meaning of the body. That if you're charged for a crime, you must be told what you're being charged for. You must be kind of basically, you got to go through things like kind of a grand jury and stuff like that. This has at times been suspended, during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln threw a number of people in jail who were very critical of the war that were Northern Democrats. They called them Copperheads. All right, and so this had been suspended on certain occasions. All right, but essentially, the Constitution specifically states in times, when it's not insurrection, when it's not war, stuff like that, that you can't specifically kind of suspend this. All right, these are the kind of the big three, in sense that it's listed that Congress cannot do. All right, but again, fine print. There is fine print that kind of from certain circumstances allows for this to kind of happen, if you will. All right, and then also you can't tax exports. That would be kind of stupid to tax exports. All right, and you're basically kind of not generating revenue. Passing any laws that violate the Bill of Rights. All right. Favoring trade of a state. No one state should have a favorable kind of trade agreements or whatever. You can't grant titles of nobility. nor can congressmen get titles of nobility while they're in Congress, right? Like from Great Britain or whatever like that. And then withdrawing money without a law. There has to be kind of, and like, for example, like the 27th Amendment, we talked about the last amendment, that's kind of tied in with that, the idea of congressional pay. The idea that congressmen couldn't basically give themselves a raise. They could vote for that raise, but that raise they have to wait till after the next election for that raise to go in. Because then that will give the voters an opportunity to say, you know what, hell, no, screw you, you're not getting a raise. All right, I'm going to vote you out. So that's the 27th Amendment was kind of tied in with that. All right, but this, like I said, if you look at the Constitution, this is the kind of the longest article, all right, that deals with kind of what Congress can and cannot do. All right, and like I said, the big thing they're talking about is the elastic clause. Gives Congress a lot more flexibility and such. Was that the last slide? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay. All right, so we'll talk about on Thursday how a bill becomes a law. All right, and then we will test next week. Anybody join the Google Meets?